sciences and related fields on a global scale. And we are also trying to find a way to represent students on events that are organized by international organizations and leaders in the forestry world. And as a regional representative, IFSA UBC and our group here, we do not only try to engage us in student life here at the faculty, for example with our International Forestry Film Festival that we had last month, but we are also trying to find ways how we can combine and connect the work of IFSA International with our community here. And climate change is one such issue. In just over a week from now, global leaders will meet in Paris to discuss a possible new agreement on climate change. And media attention and expectations are high that this will mean a new breakthrough in the global climate politics. But what does COP21 mean to us? So this event tonight and the panel discussion is really meant to give us, as interested and concerned members of our society, the opportunity to crack open the climate negotiation process and to ask questions and to gain new insights. And therefore we are delighted and very happy to have this wonderful panel here with us tonight. Please give a warm welcome to Jennifer Allan, Khalil Walji, Kristy Buckley, Jessie Way, and Dr. George Hoberg. We are trying to share this event tonight also with people that cannot be here in person. So right now we are running a live stream on a webinar. And in case people are interested to use Twitter to post questions or to send comments, this is our hashtag that you can use, IFSACOP21. And now Jennifer Allan will start us out with the first talk. We are going to give the panelists the opportunity to give a 10-minute speech each roughly. And I kindly ask you to hold back questions and comments because afterwards we will open the floor for a broader discussion. So Jennifer Allan is a senior writer of the Earth Negotiation Bulletin of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And in this function, she has attended all the climate meetings running up to the upcoming Paris event. And the topic of climate change is actually also presented in her professional work and in her academic work. Jen studies the changing nature of climate activism, particularly the rise of social issues and activist efforts. She holds a Master in International Development from the University of Guelph and has worked as a project manager with the Clean Air Strategic Alliance and IUCN. So welcome, Jennifer. The floor is yours for the first talk.
So I think I'm the sole technophobe that doesn't have slides, so I'll just stay here. And then the other disclaimer is that there's an interactive component. So one of the dangers about going to all the negotiations is you sort of seep into that world of delegates that sit around a table and they always talk to one another, which means acronyms and jargon and terms that sound like regular words that we use but mean something totally different to them. So if I use any of those and you don't know what I'm saying, just put up your hands. That's your job, and then I'll just try not to do it. So I've been tasked with sort of setting the stage. So what is the COP? How did we get here? Why does Paris matter? Because frankly, we've been doing this for 25 years. So I have 10 minutes. So wish me luck. We started this in 1990. So it's been 25 years that the international community has tried to deal with the issue of climate change. And in 1990, they said, okay, this is a big issue. We need to deal with this. And they came up with something called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 18 months. It was very quick. And that Framework Convention, so first acronym, the UNFCCC or UNFCCC, is sort of a frame for how all of these efforts to address climate change will be dealt with by states. So it has principles, like maybe you've heard of common but differentiated responsibilities, which now in Paris has grown to become common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of national circumstances. There's no acronym for that one. And it also creates divisions amongst states. So there's, Annex 1 countries, so developed countries, roughly, and non-Annex 1 countries, so roughly developing countries. And in 1990, this wasn't a big deal. We're just out of the Cold War. And thinking that there's a global north, global south, that there's developed, that there's developing, that was just sort of normal. And then the mid-90s hit, and the late 90s hit, and the negotiations for the Kyoto Protocol start. And this idea that developed countries are historically responsible was still true, but there's this group of emerging economies. So China, India, they were emerging and their emissions were growing, and developed countries, particularly the US, wanted to see that they also would start to address their emissions. Because there's a comparative advantage thing. So why would the US, at the time it was viewed that you have to sacrifice your economy for the environment, why would the US do that if other countries weren't? So the Kyoto Protocol was working with this frame, developed countries, developing countries. And they had to figure out what to do. And so the Kyoto Protocol was a made-in-the-US solution. It was, or it still is, it still exists, but we can talk about that later. It's 5-year commitment period, so how are your emissions over 5 years, not just one given year in case they go up or down. It's a basket of gases, so if you're not so good at CO2, maybe you're pretty good at methane or hydrofluorocarbons. There's market mechanisms, and there's forest sinks, so flexibility mechanisms. So even if your emissions are here, but you plant a whole lot of forests, on paper it looks like you've sucked some of those up and your emissions are lower. And so the Kyoto Protocol sets up a lot of these type of mechanisms. And a lot of these were designed to get the US on board. But unfortunately, the first thing that President George W. Bush did was say that they will not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And so the effort then to make the Kyoto Protocol real, to make it enter into force, so legally this is something that exists and is binding, and a whole bunch of countries have said that they're on board with it. They had to get enough developed countries that represent 55% of global emissions to go home to their countries and pass a national law that says we are bound by the Kyoto Protocol. Now the US was 38% of global emissions. So it was this big mobilization that countries needed to do. So the EU got on board, that's a big chunk. Canada ratified, that was a pretty good sized chunk. And then the key linchpin of all was Russia. So again, forests. Russia had a lot of forests, and they had a lot of really outdated Soviet-era technology that was polluting like you wouldn't believe. Then they, had a recession, so emissions sort of took care of themselves in the long run. So this was a mobilization. It was all about how do we get developed countries on board now that the US is out of the picture. So they did that. But how do you address climate change when the world's largest emitter does not have targets? When another large emitter, Canada, pulls out, when other large emitters don't meet their targets, and when growing emitters like China, India, Indonesia don't have any legally binding targets. And so that's why we don't really talk about the Kyoto Protocol in any way that sort of addresses the issue anymore. So they've extended the Kyoto Protocol, and they started negotiations because they had to replace it. They needed a new tool. And those negotiations started in 2007, and they went until 2009. So has anyone heard the word Copenhagen coming up lately? Yeah. So 2009, Copenhagen, we're supposed to have a brand new agreement. People were calling it Hopenhagen. Everyone was on board that this was going to be something that the world could finally say, we're all on board with this. And it wouldn't just be the US, it would be developed countries generally. It would be developing countries saying, yes, we're going to reduce our emissions, we're going to save the climate. And the momentum and the expectations were incredible. The Bella Center, where all of the negotiations were happening, fit 15,000 people. And the Secretariat thought, that's huge. 25,000 people showed up. So the first thing that happened was civil society was not allowed in, because they had to get the country delegates were the priority. The other thing that happened was civil society was mad about that and started civil disobedience in the streets. And then delegates didn't know what was going on because a small group of world leaders, so about 25 or so, went into a room by themselves and drafted what was called, or what became later, the Copenhagen Accord. And then it was leaked to the media. So Vanuatu, Venezuela, they found out that they were supposed to be signing on to this thing from The Guardian and from other media sources. So transparency issues just ruled and dominated this conference. And so there's this thing called the Copenhagen Accord, and it's, they had to officially take note of it after an all-nighter, I think. It was at least 12 hours. But what it does is it says, we all agree that global temperature rise should not be more than 2 degrees. So that 2 degrees we all keep hearing about. That was started, that was through Copenhagen. It also set up rules or at least promises around climate finance. So 100 billion per year starting in 2020. and in the meantime, what was called Fast Start Finance. So really kicking into gear that developing countries need support, not only to reduce their emissions, but to undertake adaptation, so to adapt to the effects of climate change that are already being felt around the world. So those two sort of pillars, reducing your emissions mitigation and the adapting to effects adaptation, would be supported by climate finance. And then a lot of the other texts, so heading into Copenhagen, the text was 200 pages long. A lot of that text was essentially shelved. And then a year later in Cancun, they managed to get a lot of it through and agree to a lot of it. So rules around reducing emissions from deforestation, degradation in developing countries, so RED or RED+. That was finally agreed in Cancun after a lot of years. So a lot of that went through. They still had this issue that the Kyoto Protocol was going to expire. So in 2011, they had another big COP, so Conference of the Parties, one of these massive conferences. I think that was maybe 12,000 people or so, maybe more. And they agreed to negotiate a protocol, legal instrument, or another agreed outcome with legal force, so very much UN jargonese. And those negotiations are to complete in 2015, so that's Paris. And it takes effect in 2020. So 2012, 2013, 2014, and 2015. They gave themselves 3-4 years to negotiate this. Given that they hadn't managed to do it since the Kyoto Protocol, a lot of people thought this was pretty ambitious. And so what they've done is they've taken a different approach. So the Kyoto Protocol says, thou shalt reduce your emissions by this much below 1990 by this year. And it's a top-down idea of an international agreement telling countries what you'll reduce your emissions by. Following sort of what was happening in Copenhagen, the Paris Agreement is going to flip that on its head. So instead, every country is asked, what is your contribution to the international agreement? Please tell us. And so in typical jargonese, it's called an Intended Nationally Determined Contribution, an INDC. And so this is sort of seeped into the lexicon. And so if you're interested, these INDCs are already submitted. I think almost 100 countries, representing over 90% of global emissions, have submitted their INDC. And you can go online, there's an INDC portal. You can click on the country, you can read what they've submitted, you can read their plans for how they're going to achieve this. And an INDC can be almost anything. So it could be a target. Canada has said, and this was submitted by the Harper government, so it could be changed. Canada has said that we will reduce our emissions roughly 28-30% below 2005 levels by, we said 2025. Basically what we said what the Americans said. Europe has said 40% below 1990. But China, they've said they promised to peak their emissions by 2030, and then they'll come back down. But there's no number for what that peak is. Other countries have said, we're going to implement some policies, like climate policies around pricing or forests. And then other countries have said, we're going to have projects. We're going to install X number of wind turbines and solar, and we're going to build more levees and plant more mangroves to help our adaptation efforts. And so these INDCs are this mixed bag of kind of everything. Everything you can imagine, because intended nationally determined, if you are, say, the Seychelles or a small island developing state, or if you're the US, your contribution should actually look pretty different. So the trick of all of this is that now that so many of them are in, people have started tallying. What does this mean? And so right now the way it looks is if you add up all these INDCs, put them all in a pot, and say that they will be fully implemented, that puts us on track for anywhere between 2.5 and 3.7 degrees temperature rise. So it's not enough. And so in Paris, these INDCs, they're here, and people will be saying, how can we get them to ratchet up efforts? And so there's new principles being negotiated around don't backslide. What they're looking at is creating a way to make this negotiation more dynamic. So every 5 years, we're going to look at what your INDC is, what you've achieved, and we're going to get you to ratchet it up. And then 5 years later, new cycle, ratchet it up. And so that's the model that they're starting to work under. So this bottom-up world where we ratchet up in cycles. And then in Paris, there also, another big thing is climate finance. So this promise, 100 billion a year by 2020, and every year after 2020. We're not actually that close to that. So one of the problems is we have no good way of actually monitoring or measuring how much climate finance there is, because countries count it differently. So one country might say, I'm helping support this project which will bring energy efficiency to a city in the global south. And that's climate finance because it's energy efficient. And to that country, they say, well, no, that's official development assistance. Thanks. It's not new, it's not additional to what you were going to give me anyways. And so there's no good way of counting all this. So estimates right now is that we're about at 35 billion a year. Maybe more. It sort of depends on who you ask. So the call for more climate finance is loud. The other thing that we can see maybe in Paris that's emerged in the negotiations is that the balance between mitigation, so reducing your emissions, and adaptation, building resilience to the effects of climate, those two have to be on balance. It's always been mitigation, mitigation, mitigation. And countries are saying, this is ridiculous. The sea's already rising, our water's already becoming salinated, storms are increasing in intensity, and now all this research shows that there's disproportionate effects on different segments of society. So there's gendered impacts to food security, gendered impacts to crop problems, to natural disasters. So the most vulnerable are hit the hardest. And so adaptation needs to be just as important now, because we aren't mitigating enough. And then there's a new area which some countries have said is make or break for Paris. And it's called loss and damage. So when mitigation fails, when adaptation fails, then we're into this loss and damage world, where the losses associated with the impacts of climate change are irreversible. So if your community is hit by a super typhoon, the livelihoods of those people are lost forever until the community rebuilds and rebuilds its economy. So things like that are emerging, that it's another area of negotiations that people are saying we really need to deal with this. And then the last thing is, how are we going to comply? So every country is putting in its target or its policy or its project or its peak, and how are we going to hold that country accountable? So the Kyoto Protocol has a compliance mechanism, but it's kind of like putting a bunch of toddlers in a sandbox and saying, I'm leaving, so you guys all play nice, and don't tell me if something goes wrong, just manage it yourself. It doesn't work so well. And that's, I hate to call countries toddlers, but sometimes. And so it's really, they're policing each other. And so you don't want to pull out that stick and say, impose a trade sanction or something, because later if you fail, that's going to happen to you. And so negotiating a compliance mechanism, there probably will be one, but who knows how much teeth it'll actually have. And so Paris right now, the text it's not 200 pages, thank goodness, but it's long. And it actually got longer in the last negotiation in October rather than shorter. And so there's a lot of political trade-offs that need to be made. There's a lot of political choices that need to be made. Thankfully, the world leaders are showing up for the first 2 days, and then they're actually physically removing them from the site, so they can't pull another Copenhagen. And so at the end of the day, what we might see happening is a short political document and then a list. Here are all the things we actually didn't get done, and we promised to get them done by 2020. We'll work on this, we promise. And so Paris in some ways is the beginning of action. It's setting the world in the right direction. It's putting countries on notice that they have to have some thought process to what are your policies, what are your projects. And so the fact that more countries have submitted their policies than ever before is encouraging. That's some reason for hope. At least the whole world is starting to say we're all moving in the same direction, and this is what the direction looks like. And it is significantly under business as usual. The other thing that Paris is going to do, because it's showing that we're all moving in that direction, is it will catalyze action that's already happening with civil society, with the private sector, international organizations. church groups, community groups, I mean, all of the work that cities and all these subnational groups are doing really add up to a lot. And Paris can help create the frame for all of that work that's already underway and all that work that really does add up to then get to the next level and get to the next step. That's the first. And nobody put up their hands.
Thank you so much. Khalil Walji. You will use PowerPoint slides. Yeah. So Khalil holds a bachelor degree in resource conservation from the Faculty of Forestry. He currently works as a junior researcher for the Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust. He is also pursuing his master just across the street here in the Faculty for Land and Food Systems. And he studies the set-aside stewardship program and its economic and environmental viability for farmers in Delta, just south of Vancouver. And he has been an active member at IFSA for several years now. And he was able to attend various international events as an IFSA delegate, such as the COP20 in Lima last year, and the Major Group Partnership on Forests meeting under the United Nations Forum on Forests in Kathmandu this March. And Khalil Walji will give us a little input about his experience of being a delegate at those events, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Don't look, it's supposed to be a surprise. Okay, so we'll present you in the seats. Thank you for the introduction, Micah. I wanted to start off by saying thank you guys for attending tonight. We've had a great representation at international meetings from local members of IFSA at UBC. However, sometimes we struggle with our local committee to build a lot of capacity just because of a lot of our members are either grad students or are in their upper years, and so we have a lot of turnover. So if there are any undergrads here, I recognize a few, but if there are any undergrads, we'd love to see you out to IFSA. We meet usually on Mondays or Wednesdays, so there's my little plug for any undergrads who'd like to come out and join our organization. We have snacks sometimes. All right, so I'll try not to take too much time. I'm not a content expert at all with a lot of these high-level profile meetings. My presentation will be more on my experience as a youth delegate at some of these high-level meetings. So I'll generally go over the three conferences I was lucky enough to attend, talk about what my expectations were going into them, and then what the reality was once I arrived, and just a few reflections. So, as Micah mentioned, within the past year, I've been fortunate enough to attend the COP20 negotiations in Lima, which I'll contrast first with the Global Landscapes Forum, and the Global Landscapes Forum is run in between the first week and the second week of COP. It's the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and it usually marks the changeover for our IFSA delegates. So 5 delegates will attend for the first week. We'll all attend the Global Landscapes Forum, and then the second week is the second group of delegates that go and have an opportunity to attend. And both weeks are very different because different things are happening in COP between the first and the second week. The other conference I was lucky enough to attend was the Major Groups Partnership on Forests in Nepal. And that was a completely different conference. It was much smaller than the COP conference, nothing near 15,000 to 25,000 people, more just below 100. And that one was definitely the most fulfilling conference just because our participation was much, we had a lot more participation in that conference, and so I'll make some contrasts with that. But yeah, let me begin with COP20. So naturally, my expectations of this event were high. I've taken Dr. Hoberg's policy class during my undergrad here, where we...
You did very well.
Where we obviously touch on the IPCC and the UNFCCC. Thank you for clarifying some of those jargon terms. I had followed the COP events peripherally throughout my undergrad, and we've all heard about the legacy of the Kyoto Protocol. So to say the least, I was extremely excited to be chosen to attend this prestigious event. As a student studying forestry or environmental sciences or any climate theme degree, it's really like getting tickets to your favorite rock concert, but it's not. Maybe that's a bad analogy, but yeah, to be honest, I was really excited. So I have spoken to as soon as we arrived at Lima, I did speak to previous members who have been to COP, and they did mention that it can be quite dry, especially the plenary sessions where it is a lot of, just processes and a lot of gavels hitting, and they don't really talk about a lot of things. It's more organization. You 7 countries are interested in in this topic, great, go to a separate room and discuss it amongst yourselves. So really being part of civil society, sometimes you don't feel privy to the meat and the bones of the conference, and you're more just watching the process happen. So yeah, essentially before going to this event, I built it up in my head. But I thought the participation, especially for youth, would be more. There was a single youth event at COP. It was an hour and a half. And the questions that we were asked before we went to COP really built this up as well. But I'm not crazy. I wasn't delusional. I didn't think that they were going to ask a bunch of forestry students from around the world, hey, how do we solve these problems? How do we fix this big mess? How are we going to mitigate emissions? How are we going to monitor and value sequestration? Obviously, these are very difficult questions to answer, and I wasn't expecting that they would even consult us on this, but I was expecting a little bit more participation, especially in an hour and a half session called the youth session. So what we got, however, was in an hour and a half block, we got a guitar presentation for half an hour, followed by 20 minutes of get-to-know-you games. Kumbaya, it really did feel like summer camp. And that was disappointing. I think we were all a little bit disappointed at the level of engagement for youth and participation. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. We did have the opportunity to interact with a lot of scientists and other delegates from around the world, and really the defining events at COP for youth and youth delegates specifically is the side events. That's the best part of being there, and my advice to Jesse, who will be going, actually Jesse and another former UBC alumni, Olivia Sanchez, will both be going to COP, and Gia left this year. And so my advice to both of them would be to obviously do their best to look through the schedule for the side events and focus on the ones you're most interested in. So that's just a little bit about my expectations, the reality, and a bit of reflection on COP. Here's some photos of COP, and I don't want to say that it wasn't not worthwhile to go. I really enjoyed myself there. The atmosphere and sort of the idealistic notion of having 100+ countries trying to come to an agreement that's really has ramifications for the future it was incredible to be there. But I think you just have to check your reality before you get there as far as what you expect. So yeah, just some quick pictures of us at COP. It was really fun to be there. Just to give you guys an example, if you go to that link at the bottom, the link for the side events is already up. So if you want to have a look at some of the side events that will be being run at the same time as COP, it is online. They're roughly delineated into those 4 categories: adaptation-related issues, mitigation-related issues, cross-cutting issues, and others. And so as an IFSA delegation, we try to obviously pick things we were interested in, as well as try to separate a little bit. So we didn't all go to the same events, so that in our report after, we could report on a bit of diverse side events. Let's see, the next thing is the Global Landscapes Forum. We'll move on to that. So as a conference, this conference was in charge of bringing 1,500 participants together to speak about landscape approaches with the hope of informing the future UNFCCC negotiations and agreements and how they can achieve the sustainable development goals. So youth played a much bigger role at this event, and I guess that was expected because IFSA is an organizing member of that conference. So there was much more focus on engaging youth. There was a whole day, which was the Youth and Landscapes Forum, which was the Friday before the Saturday and Sunday conference. So again, my advice to Jesse and any other youth members who will be going as observer delegates, the side events, including this Global Landscapes Forum, is much more informative. We had brainstorming sessions with professionals where we would talk about things like the green economy. We were forced to network. Even if you're a shy person, you had to network and get a minimum of 5 cards. They were expecting it because they had tons of cards to give to us. So we were forced to network, which was great. We also did a half-day master's class. When you put that on your resume, sometimes people think, oh, you have a master's in networking. And that's not the case. It is a half-day class, so you do have to clarify that sometimes. But we had a master's class in networking, in pitching, and in facilitation. So it really was more of a professional development kind of conference, but really helped, I think, give the entire delegation a bit more confidence when approaching professionals and scientists and negotiators the next day at the Global Landscapes Forum. So I myself participated in the pitching exercise. And let's see what else we got. Okay, and then the last conference I had the opportunity to attend was the Major Groups Partnership on Forests in Nepal in 2015. So again, Olivia, who you can see in the top right there, is a UBC alum from here. She is now at the Yale School of Forestry, and she attended this Nepal conference and will also be in COP. So you can see that's the plenary in the bottom picture there, so much smaller than 15,000 people at COP. Really the major difference with this is you felt that youth had a voice. This conference was about civil society coming together and creating a policy document that was coherent and that could be presented to the Secretariat. Yeah, and I mean, although sometimes the voice can get lost when there are 9 different civil society groups that are all talking, so sometimes the voice gets lost.
To the United States, I am an American, so don't throw anything at me. Just badly. So as Micah mentioned, I work for an organization called Meridian Institute. I'll talk a little bit about our work and compare that to some of your traditional thoughts about what an NGO does. So first off, we'll start off with a number of logos that I'm sure many of you recognize. You will come across these if you're going to COP21 or following anything. These are the types of organizations that typically come to mind when someone mentions NGO, or nonprofit organization, environmental organization. I would just say that you won't see my organization up here, Meridian Institute, because we're a bit of a strange animal in this space, in that we're not an advocacy organization. We don't have some sort of big mission that we're pushing. We're not a conservation organization. We're a neutral third-party mediation organization that provides facilitation for complex societal and public policy processes, many of which feed into the COP negotiations, but we're not advocating for any particular position. So as I go through some of the messaging and the advocacy positions from civil society, those do not represent my views or my organization's views, just to have a disclaimer there. But to give you an example of what we actually do, because many of you might scratch your heads and say, well, what do you mean you facilitate things on the margins of policy processes? So a couple of examples for our work are convening, which means bringing together negotiators and different stakeholders from private sector businesses, from civil society NGOs, from governments, from research institutes, together to talk about key issues in the negotiation process. So this might be RED, reducing emissions from deforestation or degradation, or it could be the treatment of land use in future climate agreement. And our job would be to design and facilitate those consultations, and that those consultations would inform an independent expert author team that would then use that as information to devise a report that assesses, here are some policy options, here are some technical options, here are some pros and cons, and here are some recommendations for the negotiators to consider. And so 2 examples of the reports that we've helped to produce are there on the left, land use and RED. And one of the things that we hear from the negotiators themselves is that it's not so much the report that comes out at the end that's the most valuable. It was just being able to sit informally in the room with other negotiators and talk off the record as individuals without putting their formal negotiating caps on. That was really the most valuable thing of the exercise. So that's an example of our work. Next, I'm going to give you a sense of the messages that are coming out of the kind of broader NGO civil society landscape going into COP. I've tried to capture a few of the key messages in a couple of the reports. NGOs and civil society actually have the opportunity to submit formal positions to the COP as well, so you can actually look those up in addition to the INDCs. But 2 reports in particular that struck me were these 2 up here in case you're interested in having a look, and I'll quickly review some of the key messages from each of them. So message number 1 is more ambitious action both before and after 2020. And you'll see here on the right-hand side that this is a comparison by the Civil Society Equity Review report that shows what they would claim as fair share of contributions from the developed countries, or wealthier countries as they call them, and fair share contributions from the poor countries or the developing countries. And then on the far right you see what they are looking at as an ambition gap, or an emissions gap between what countries have put forth in their INDCs and their national contributions, and what was going to actually get us to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. So we have about a 15 gigaton gap in terms of getting to where we need to be. Message number 2 from the NGO community is inspire confidence, meaning that these commitments in the INDCs need to be delivered in a timely and credible manner that has some sort of legal framework. They don't stipulate exactly what that legal framework is, but something to provide some assurance and confidence that includes clear accounting rules and some transparency mechanisms. Message number 3, which is related to that, is equity. So as Jen mentioned, it's a bit of what I would call a potluck dinner in terms of what every country has put on the table for their contribution. And it's like comparing apples and oranges. It's really difficult to compare what did China put on the table versus Brazil versus the United States versus Canada versus Germany. And so determining how you have comparability between those contributions and comparing that to what that country is capable of and what their responsibility is going to be important going forward. Another message we've heard is having a long-term perspective. So as Jen mentioned, again, creating a mechanism that's going to allow for ratcheting up of ambition over time. And the proposal is to do 5-year commitment periods, and over those 5 years keep ratcheting up the level of ambition until, ideally, according to NGO, that you phase out fossil fuel pollution by 2050 completely. Another message that Jen also talked about was this gap in finance and scaling up finance for adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development, and in particular, seeking ways to align with existing finance mechanisms, so official development assistance, but also galvanizing new finance and leveraging the private sector in that. And one vehicle in particular that you may have heard of or you might hear about in relation to COP21 is the Green Climate Fund and getting that up to 100 billion. Enother message that is quite specific on forests is getting a framework for action on reducing deforestation, enhancing sustainable agriculture, and accounting for land use. And again, this points to having proper finance and clear emissions rules. Jen and I were just talking before this about the fact that there's different sets of accounting rules depending on if you're a developed or a developing country and what type of land use you're talking about. So again, if you're a developing country that's put in an agriculture land use contribution as part of your IDC, you have different accounting rules applying to you than another country. So again, getting a framework that's going to apply to all of them that is comparable and that's easy to understand, we hope, is what they're asking for. And then finally, the last message that I've captured from the NGO community is creating more linkages between the climate agreement and the Sustainable Development Goal Agreement. In the fact that these are mutually beneficial to one another and they can be quite complementary. And so looking for ways to more intentionally create linkages there is going to be helpful. And I would say overall, aside from these specific messages about what civil society and NGOs are looking for out of the COP, I would say that you can expect to see and maybe even participate in some of this, that civil society really brings the momentum to help bridge the gap. And this is going to happen both before, during, and after Paris, because in all likelihood we will still have an emissions gap between what is needed and what is contributed. And this is where civil society plays a really big role, so you can expect to see them doing that, and hopefully you can be a part of it. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Interesting input from an NGO observer's perspective. And now our next talk will be given by the current IFSA president, which is Jesse Wade. He holds a Bachelor of Science from the Faculty of Forestry and Natural Resource Conservation, and he recently completed a practicum at the UBC farm. And now he currently does some research here at UBC looking at human land use impacts on stream ecosystems. And just over a week from now he will attend COP21 and will represent IFSA there as a delegate. And now he will provide us with a bit of a background information on the role of youth on these events and how he's planning to get involved and his expectations for this participation.
Thank you,
The floor is yours.
All right, good evening, everybody. So as mentioned, I'll be heading to Paris in just over a week from now, and I'll be a IFSA delegate, and I'll be attending some of the similar conferences that Khalil mentioned that he attended last year in Lima. So I'll be at COP21 during the second week of the event. I'll attend the Global Landscapes Forum during the weekend in between, and I also have the opportunity to attend the Youth in Landscapes Initiative during the first week, which is kind of an advancement on what Khalil mentioned on the Friday that he had the opportunity to attend. This event that I will be going to is from the Tuesday until the Friday. And so I'm going to just kind of outline some of my expectations for these different events and how they compare from what I've heard from both speaking to Khalil and some from previous experiences I've had at other events. I also just wanted to touch on a little more information on what IFSA's role is in general at these kind of UN higher level international processes. Khalil mentioned a few things, but for some further information, so IFSA is a group that is considered a UN major group, children and youth. So back in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, one of the recognizations was that for civil society to have a voice, they wanted some sort of representation, and that's one of the things they came up with were these different major groups. And so one of which is children and youth, and so there are there's a number of different organizations that fall under each major group, and we fit under this banner. And so what that means is that we get to send delegates to each of these different conferences. I had the opportunity to go to the United Nations Forum on Forests in New York earlier in the year in May, and there's the Convention on Biological Diversity, so there's a few different of these high-level international processes that IFSA gets to send delegates to. Khalil mentioned that for COP20, what he went to, and this similar for this, is that we have 5 spots to send people. And so there'll be 5 students during the first week, and then 5 different students during the second week of the event. We have observer status, and so that allows us to attend the event, but doesn't give us a whole lot of input, as mentioned by Khalil. But yeah, so as far as the selection goes for IFSA delegates, the selection process is that everything is run through our IFSA organization. Once we know that we have the 5 positions, we have a written online application for IFSA members. So technically here in forestry, all forestry students can be IFSA members, and so all forestry students here at UBC have the opportunity to apply. So yeah, we have the written application process, and then within the IFSA International organization, there is someone who is the head of the subcommission of the UNFCCC, and so that person, along with other executive members of IFSA, kind of collaborate and come up with choosing the different representatives for IFSA delegates. So some of the other events that I'll be attending is the Youth and Landscapes Initiative. That one I'd say is what I'm actually most excited about. So the Youth and Landscapes Initiative offers kind of this platform for students to have more interaction with experienced professionals. And so it allows for more discussion, more collaboration, more communication, and kind of talk about the different projects that we're working on. So as far as my expectations for each of the events and how they will compare, with my experience at UNFF is I kind of got that first-hand perspective of just being an observer and watching and listening, but what was really going on is they're going through the text line by line, word by word, and you realize that, yeah, as a youth delegate, you don't actually have a whole lot of input, and so it's kind of an awakening realization that you have these amazing opportunities to go and attend, and they are amazing learning opportunities, but you don't have that much like direct input, which is why the other opportunities, the Global Landscapes Forum and the Youth and Landscapes Initiative, is what I think we as youth really have a greater role when we go to these different conferences. It allows us to talk with and network and talk with other scientists and nonprofit personnel, people from government, people from industry, and it just provides a platform to kind of bring everyone together, and it allows kind of the youth voice to be heard. And so the Global Landscapes Forum, the Youth and Landscapes Initiative, both of these are what I'm kind of expecting to kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say enjoy more, but where I'll see more value, kind of like get more out of my experience in Paris. The COP itself, I think, it's an amazing learning opportunity just to kind of like learn how these processes work like firsthand and see it with my own eyes, whereas the other events give more opportunity for actual input and kind of like youth involvement. And so for the Youth Landscapes Initiative, basically what this is it's bringing 50 youth from around the world. The application process was a combination of a written application and a video, and a part of the application was to describe projects that you're working on, that you're interested in, what you're doing to kind of provide solutions or provide steps forward on kind of like facing some of these challenges that we face. And so the challenge that I'm going to be a part of is this Finance and Trade Landscape Challenge, which is focusing on smallholder agriculture and trying to increase the equity and transparency between smallholder farmers and the companies that buy raw materials from them. And so it's kind of looking at agriculture, food production, and looking at how we can improve the sustainability of food chains and what the role of smallholder, small-scale agriculture is in an integrated landscape. One of the main ideas and main topics of both the Global Landscapes Forum and this Youth and Landscape Initiative is that when we're managing the different environmental parameters, when we're looking at solutions for climate change, we really need to be looking at it on a landscape basis and really looking at each of the different sectors that our society has and looking at them as kind of different parts of a larger whole. And so we have forestry, we have agriculture, we have mining, you have urbanization, and really these forums, as far as my discussions with people before, as far as my reading up on them, from what I know, it's kind of like an opportunity to bring the people in from the different avenues, from the different sectors, and really it allows for cross-collaboration, for interdisciplinary conversations. And so the Youth and Landscapes Initiative really then takes that and focuses it towards us as students and us as youth, and how we can then integrate as well. I guess for me, I grew up on a farm, and I guess, yeah, and I recently completed a practicum in sustainable agriculture. So agriculture has always been a huge part of my life, and I see our food system and the current way that we produce food as really at the root of a lot of our environmental degradation that we see. And I really see food as a means of connecting people and really providing solutions going forward. I think there's a lot of, every day we eat, every day we get to make an impact on the environment through what we choose to eat or what we choose not to eat. And so I'm really excited about being able to go to Paris and get involved in this project where I'll actually be able to network with people and communicate with other students, communicate with people working on the ground, and really kind of discuss the different topics that are really we're passionate about and that we're interested in pursuing. And so, yeah, I guess as far as the expectations go, this is the part of going to Paris that I think is really going to be quite valuable. This is a picture from New York, and we're kind of off to the side. All of the main country official delegations are on the ground, on the floor. They have their podiums, and we're kind of just off to the side viewing and observing. And so, yeah, kind of I've already spoken to this, but just really reiterating that I see COP21, when I think of COP, and I think of COP21, for me the whole experience is kind of combined. I see the Global Landscapes Forum, the Youth and Landscapes Initiative, COP21 all as one event for me, whereas technically COP21 is the negotiation process of the individual countries. But for me, I see it more as this integrated event, this integrated experience. And so through each of the different events, I think combining them will provide provides more of a whole experience. And so I look forward to just being able to network, to be able to discuss some of the topics that I've been involved in, and really just be on the ground and kind of discuss on the ground what's happening in civil society, what's happening here at UBC, what's happening amongst forestry students, and kind of take that forward and see what we as youth can provide to the conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Jesse, for your interesting input. And now we have our last 10 minutes talk by Dr. Hoberg, who most of you may know. He's a professor here at the Faculty of Forestry. He's a political scientist by training, and Dr. Hoberg taught public policy and American politics at UBC for 13 years before he joined the faculty permanently in 2001. He specializes in environmental and natural resource policy and governance and has focused on processes around the climate negotiations for many years. His current research centers on BC electricity policy and environmental governance and of the oil sands, including transportation issues over pipelines. And he's also an associate of the Department of Political Science and the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability, and a member of the Clean Energy Research Center. Thank you very much for being here tonight, Dr. Hoberg. He's going to provide us a bit of an insight of the role of COP here in Canada and possible implications for this country.
Thanks.
The floor is yours.
Is it a problem for anything if I turn those off?
No, that's right.
Because, you know, he's such a beautiful man. I want to appreciate that. Right? Times are really changing. It is a very interesting picture when you look at, you know, the journalists and policy wonks use this phrase of gravitas. Does our dude have gravitas? We didn't think so. But you put him on the same place, that's look, he's taller than the rest of them. Maybe he does. But I want to talk about it, and this subtitle there is kind of, to get the pun, what was Trudeau's major campaign line? Real change. So my whole thing is, we're a role model for real change, and I'll elaborate that on a little bit. Now, a couple of people, Jen mentioned this, and I just want to set the context with the magnitude of the challenge that we face. We do really face a crisis. If we continue along the current path, we're heading towards a world which would be about 4.5 C. There's always air bounds around that, warmer than we are now, which would be, well, cataclysmic. We would not want to live in that world. If we implement all of the INDCs, the national commitments that the countries have made to the Paris process, we could get to 3.5 C, which is also a very unpleasant world, according to the models that we have. Don't panic though, because there's kind of a misinterpretation of it. No one is thinking that the INDCs that are being presented to Paris is the end of the game. There's this idea, as you were saying, of the ratcheting up that would be continuous. And we can actually get to 2C. 1.5 would be a bit of a stretch. That probably requires removing things from the atmosphere, but it is feasible to get to 2C, but it's going to be very hard. And part of the reason it's very hard is climate change is about the hardest problem that you could imagine. We have a problem structure that makes it almost impossible. We have costs that are imposed locally and benefits that occur globally because of the nature of the way carbon mixes in the atmosphere. We have costs that are imposed now to produce benefits. The way the lag in the climate system works is the response to the climate system is 50 to 100 years later. And it's uncertain, and it's global, and it's distant in the future. And this creates a tragedy of the commons where each individual effort, whether you're thinking about individual person, organization, province, or country, they can't all add up. That each incentive is to do something different than what's good for the public good. And so you have this problem that's almost impossible. And then you take an institution, with all due respect, Jen, I know you love these treaties. 195 or 196 parties.
Depends on how you count the EU.
So the 195 plus the EU, which equals 196, is that how it works?
Yeah.
You know how many of those have to agree to it? What's the answer to that? All of them. It requires unanimity among 195 countries, plus the EU. That seems to be a recipe for disaster in terms of decision making. But that's the decision-making framework that we have. And what can we make of it? We'll see. So that's just a kind of a context and how difficult it is. Next I want to say, but despair not, because every study that's been done about the future of the energy system, and if you're interested in this, come take my course, Conservation 425, next term. There aren't any spots left, but if you're here tonight and you say, George, can I take a course? I'll let you into the course. The way we think about it is it's both feasible technologically and it's affordable economically. In fact, it's so affordable that it seems absurd that we don't immediately lurch in this direction. The way to think about the transformation energy system, there's really three core pillars of a switch. One is that you need to become as efficient as you possibly can. The second is that you need to take the electricity that you make for our lights and other things, and you need to completely get the carbon out of it. So if you're going to use coal, you have to bury the carbon that comes out of it, and you've got to use renewable for that. Then you take the end uses that you have, driving a car, being in a bus, heating your home, etc., and you have to electrify all that. That's the key. We've shown that you can do that by 2050 technologically. And if you do it, this is the IPCC, you're all familiar with that. Their numbers for what happens to economic growth. So the assumption, by you have two periods, 2030 and 2050. For 2030, the GDP growth is supposed to be 100% on the current path. Okay? If you implement policies that will get you to 2C, economic growth will be 98% in 2030. And in 2050, economic growth will be 240% above where we are now, and it will be reduced by 4 percentage points to 236. So that cost seems so minimal that it just seems absurd that we don't do it. If you put that in annualized term, the annualized global GDP loss by moving from the current path to a 2C scenario is 0.06 per year. So next time you hear a conservative politician or an oil company talking about how we just can't do it, tell them to read the IPCC. Where does Canada fit in all of this? So that it's technologically feasible and affordable. How does it work out in terms of countries? Canada is the, is that 8th or 9th? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we're number 9 in terms of global GDP emissions. So we're a relatively small actor, about 1.6, 1.7% of total annual emissions. But we're one of the biggest in the world. Okay. And there's two ways to look at our contribution. One is annual emissions. Probably a better way to look at it, because of the way the atmosphere is like, it's a sink. It's a big bathtub that we filled up with carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide lasts 100 years in the atmosphere. So historic emissions are more important than any annual emission. And when you do that, we're basically ranked the same, and with about the same percent. We're about 2% of the legacy of carbon that's sitting in the atmosphere now. That's our own responsibility. So that's relatively small, but again, compared to other countries, except the really giant ones, we're pretty big. What's really shocking when you look at Canada is our per capita emissions. Among the top 10 emitters, we're not number 9 or number 8. We're number 1. It's like hockey. Why are we number 1? Is it because it's so cold? Is it because we live so far apart? Actually, Sweden, Norway, etc., they're as cold as we are. They have much, much lower GHG emissions per capita. Do we live far apart? We think we do, because it's a big country. We're one of the most urbanized nations in the world. There's no excuse other than the fact that we waste a lot of energy and that we have a lot of fossil fuels that we love, 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 especially in Alberta. So we have, I would think, a special obligation to play a significant role in reducing emissions. So what are we doing? This is what our current trends look like. This is history. And if we eliminated all policies controlling carbon, we'd be crazy up there. If we keep our current measures of existing policies in place, by 2020, we would continue to grow and be about just still below our peak, but nowhere near the target we committed to in Copenhagen. Our target now is down here for the new Paris. This stuff, by the way, is almost all oil sands. That's why people fret so much about the oil sands. They're not the majority, or not even 10% yet of global, of Canadian greenhouse gases, but they are the only major component of the system that's growing significantly. This is what Harper submitted. People laughed, and they should have. First of all, it's really weird. He took out the thing about the current measures. But this is our new target all the way down there, and it's a 4-page document. It's not very substantial, and about 2 paragraphs that says what we're going to do to get from here to there, and it doesn't mention the oil sands. So it was literally a ridiculous document that was ridiculed. But that's what actually is our country's current policy that we're taking to Canada, and Justin Trudeau is going to have to talk about when he goes there. What has happened to my system here? Oh, I'm in the wrong place. Hold on. Okay, what do other people think about this? Well, there's been some, and we saw some previous things of the civil society groups are comparing different things. They're comparing the INDCs. This is a World Resources efforts. That target that we have is ambitious for us, possibly almost impossible to achieve, but compared to other big nations, our peers.
And they have coordination meetings every single morning to decide what are they going to do that day. What are they going to say? So that's one entry point is, IFSA could say, you know, can we say something about land? Can we say something about forests? And put something in that statement to all of the world leaders that the youth NGOs will make. And I think maybe another part is to realize that transparency is going to be an issue in Paris. You know, we're getting down to the last days where country delegates and ministers are going to make some hard trade-offs. Like, I'll give you more climate finance if you weaken your stance on loss and damage. They don't want civil society sitting there when they have those conversations. And so a lot of civil society will be in tough, especially in the second week when you're there, to get access to some of those rooms. So I have a very handy badge, so I get in. But other people can't. And so a lot of the caution that I give people is don't put everything on that negotiation text. Instead, get into what they're calling the green zone, the civil society space, because that's where action's happening. That's where cities are working with youth groups, are working with private sector and saying, how can we do something together? And so there's more momentum there. And so I'd say, you know, yes, do stuff in the blue zone, the UN negotiation zone, work with the youngos, but get into that green zone, that civil society space where real conversations are happening about on-the-ground actions that can be taken and on-the-ground policies that are already leading to actual results.
Can I put in a word as an old man here? I actually think that it's very easy for youth to underestimate their power and influence. It is true that in these forums you're principally a listener, but if we're ever going to solve the climate problem, it's not going to be because we figure that it's in our short-term economic interest to do so. It's because we take a big moral leap, and the best inspirational force for that moral leap is the desperation of youth. That those people are negotiating your futures, and having that present voice, be staring at them as they're doing it is an incredibly powerful thing. And the youth movement needs to find a way to escalate that in the current framework. It's going to be very, very challenging. Jen, you're still talking about degree. Is there going to be a green zone?
Yeah. So.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
So the tactics we haven't discussed at all. There has been some discussion about whether or not we're going to dramatically pull back on the types of civil society participation that can occur. And I don't think we've gotten final word on it yet, so it's going to be tricky. But this is just one event. There'll be many different things and many different opportunities for youth to have a say, and I really do think that youth voice has superpower. And it's a matter of exercising it in a meaningful way in the process.
And it's going to be a great opportunity to have face-to-face to those representatives of those countries, right? So like opportunity to hold them accountable. And I heard that there, in one of the clubs there was, the youth group had these t-shirts, how old are you going to be in 2050? It's like, oh, like, yeah, most of the negotiators will be probably dead. And that was like something like that. So, you know, it's something active, like subtle but powerful. And yeah, like talk to them directly. I think it could also work.
I'm just going to touch on what George mentioned, and perhaps direct this at Kristy. But how do you think the recent events in Paris are going to impact COP?
Well, I think it's still to be determined. I was on conference calls earlier this week with different governments trying to figure out what is going to be a response. Is there going to still be side events and civil society? Is it just, there was discussion about whether or not they just have the negotiations and everything else stops. I think we haven't heard the official word, but so far the green zone is still open, side events are still happening. The only thing that they've started to say that they're really trying to prevent is big marches and demonstrations in the streets, just because it's a huge security risk and they can't possibly manage that security. But of course there's people that were really excited about demonstrating, and using that as an opportunity to increase momentum and visibility. So it is, you know, a letdown, but understandably it's a security risk. That's the latest that I know.
I've been wondering about the security that they're trying to set up. Do you think there's a possibility of further attacks, especially against the conference? Because I cannot help but wonder if the attack is supposed to take place because of all the world leaders are supposed to come. Could there be a potential risk there that we have to address?
It always is. Really, it always is. And anytime you have a global gathering like this, where you have heads of state, where you have ministers from around the world gathering, it's a huge risk. But there's pretty significant security as a result of it. And the benefit of having it in a major city is that you have that security available.
Okay. This question is slightly subjective and perhaps we're biased because we're in the Faculty of Forestry, but given that I assume most of us have heard of the words the Kyoto Protocol, Copenhagen Agreement, the UNFCCC, and now the Paris event is getting a lot of media coverage, do each of you think that climate change is the most important global environmental issue? Or are there other ones that we should be focusing on and giving more attention to?
Mr. George, you were down the line.
With all due respect, I think that's a silly question. Of course it is. But the only question is whether or not it's the single most important issue confronting humanity.
Environmental issues that we face, and so I think it's hard to just say that, to list them as one being more important. I think they are all interconnected, and climate change does offer a great platform for addressing them all through a common kind of topic and issue.
So I got that question in advance and I scratched out global environmental issue and just said global issue. That this, in my opinion, is the most important global issue. And the way that I came to that conclusion was actually by writing a policy paper in a graduate class 15 years ago, where I was asked to, basically it was a paper, but it was for a class, but it was supposed to be for the incoming Secretary of State in the United States to say, what is the most pressing global issue? From a foreign policy standpoint, from a national security standpoint, from a save the world standpoint. And I wrote that paper 6 times. I first started on disease and poverty and everything else in the world, and I just thought, you know, it doesn't, none of it matters. Unless you've got a climate that is actually livable and breathable and everything else, then all of those other things sort of come second. And it was through that writing process and advising a policymaker on what the top issue was that I came to the conclusion that it was climate change, and I've been working on the issue ever since. So I encourage you to think about that and write those policy papers and really think about what's important.
Yeah, so
Knowledge comes from writing policy. Wisdom comes from writing policy.
you guys heard how strongly George feels about that topic as well, and I was lucky enough to take his course for 4 months, so I was definitely brainwashed into you passing. You felt the same thing. But no, just to reiterate what Jesse said as well, I mean, climate change and global warming, they encompass so many different fields and have impact at so many different levels that to call it to have that definition on its own would be silly. It has an effect on so many different levels, and yeah, I definitely agree with that.
So I suggest starting with George, because I have issues sometimes if we say that it is the most pressing environmental issue for a couple reasons. One, so I agree with everything you said. Climate change is obviously extremely important. It undergirds a lot of our ecological and political and economic and social systems. But so do a lot of other things. And there are environmental issues that are very important that have nothing to do with climate change and are not impacted by climate change. So for example, the sound management of chemicals. How do we make sure we don't poison ourselves and the planet while producing enough food for people and using pesticides? E-waste. How do we make sure we're not poisoning informal pickers that are dealing with our old iPhones that we just bought because, you know, there's 6 or 7 or whatever number we're on. That's not related to climate change. And attention to those really important issues goes away because climate change has become a stand-in for sustainable development. So momentum for the state's sustainable development goals has been undercut because people are really focused on Paris and really focused on climate change. And so there's really important issues that sometimes people say, we need to deal with biodiversity. But that's related to climate change. So let's work on climate change and we'll wait for biodiversity. But there's things you can do to protect biodiversity that doesn't involve waiting for climate change. And so that's the second reason is the first reason we tend to ignore issues like e-waste, which is the largest and fastest growing waste stream in the world. And we forget that there's things that we can do on some of these other and related issues like desertification or biodiversity or poverty or disease that aren't actually directly related to mitigation. Maybe they aren't even related to adaptation. So maybe you work on water sanitation to make sure people have clean drinking water right now, and you don't wait for a climate finance project to get through a complicated stream. So I think it's sort of an all-hands-on-deck approach that doesn't necessarily just wait for us to deal with this thing that we haven't been very good at dealing with for 25 years.
This is kind of a two-part question. I was wondering if any of the proposed policy changes by the countries do show a kind of intersectional policy approach where they're addressing climate change in relation to addressing other issues in their country, such as poverty or socioeconomic factors, and also if any of the policies kind of showed a multi-part-type decision-making approach also, that it wasn't just the country proposing this policy, but a country kind of working with the parties of interest in actually formulating that policy to make sure that it's one that could be implemented. It's up to anyone.
So I haven't read them all, but I think several of the developing country ones tend to be more along those lines. So for example, creating systems for alternative livelihoods so people aren't cutting down the forest. Things like that. And a lot of them did involve some stakeholder input, but that really varies country by country.
Does that answer your question?
Dr. Hoberg, you talked about how Canada had a situation where it had set targets and then failed to put a plan in place to meet them. I'm curious if you could sort of comment on how other countries do in that regard. Do countries that set targets often meet them? If not, how much do they undercut them? And what are the implications of that going forward?
There aren't a lot of countries that have had targets that are real and meaningful. So of the ones that I know about, the EU has had an aggressive target and they are on pace to meet that target. There's a lot of people who've been critical of their main mechanism, which is the cap and trade system that they have. It's actually working pretty well and it's supposed to start biting quite soon. Other big jurisdictions like California have adopted aggressive targets. They're also on target. The US adopted a aggressive target in 2009, and Obama has managed to find a way without congressional action to make significant headway on that. So there are examples of people who have been successful. Canada is, I'm not saying we're special in our ability to ignore our targets, but we do have this habit of underthinking the importance of actually taking action that bites, that causes, that might tick off an important stakeholder. You know how Americans are, right? I'm actually,
I can't stand them.
Confrontational. They're willing to, give and take. Okay, we're so nice. We don't want to, if Alberta doesn't want to reduce emissions, well, they don't have to. Right? And of course, that's a ridiculous approach. You need to have strong central leadership in order to impose costs and redistribute costs and benefits aside in order to get anything done. And the disadvantage of the Canadian Federation, the very decentralized thing that we have, is that we've made it culturally much more difficult to do that. We'll see how the young guy does.
I might just add to it, there was an interview with the incoming Minister of Environment, Catherine McKenna, the other day on CBC, if you heard it. And basically they said, you know, we have to go to Paris with what we have, but our plan is to come back and within 90 days of returning from Paris, consult with all the major municipalities and all the provinces to come together on a plan of what can you actually do. Because the federal government can't just do a top-down imposition of here's how much you're going to reduce your emissions by if they don't have a clear sense of what is pragmatic and possible.